This is the Editor's Half Hour. Step into the life of an editor for 30 minutes as we discuss the craft of editing, industry trends, and editorial resources. Your host is co-founder and CEO of Peak Publishing Inc., Nadia Jaja Pupa. She is experienced in all facets of the publishing industry, from editing to design, and works with corporate clients and self-published authors. Nadia and her guests are about to share powerful insights and stories on what it takes to be an editor. And this is your host, Nadia Jaja Pupa.
Welcome, listeners, to the Editor's Half Hour. We are on the 10th episode of the podcast, which is big. This is still a relatively new podcast, and we are now on part 2 of editing true crime. So part 1, I interviewed Andrea Topper. She was working on a true crime story, going to prison, interviewing somebody in jail about a murder case. And, you know, it was really, really intense. I know that she's gone through a lot in her writing process. And when I asked her, let's do part 2, I'm ready to go, she's like, I'm not ready. You know, she's taking a break from writing. And so in that process, I was like, well, I still want to do a part 2. I think there's still so much to cover when it comes to editing true crime. There's a lot to talk about. And so I'm online and I'm looking and I see a book called The Girl in the Window and Other True Tales, written by Lane DeGregory, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. And this book came out this year. I think it was published just this past April. And I was like, hey, Lane, oh my gosh, she has this. First of all, she's a Pulitzer Prize winner. This book is published by the University of Chicago Press. I'm reading through this thing, and it's basically, this book is an anthology, and it's about tips for reporting, writing nonfiction narratives. And so I actually sent the book to Andrea. Hey, Andrea, did you see this book? Oh my gosh. Okay, so I need to cut this story short because I've got this amazing guest today who is not Andrea. It's Maria Carillo, or if you're a typical American, you'll say Carillo, or Carrillo is how you really would pronounce it. And I have this wonderful guest today, and that's how I met her, was actually through Lane DeGregory, the author of this anthology. And Lane said, well, I'm actually not an editor. I'm more of a writer. And I thought, well, you know, this is the Editor's Half Hour. I need to talk to an editor. There's so many questions to ask. So I want to welcome you, Maria, to this podcast. I'm so honored to have you, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time for this. But I would like to tell the listeners how exciting this is, because you've got so much experience in the newsroom. I know I'm jumping around. I'm just so excited.
It's good to be here. Nice of you to have me.
Thank you. And I want to just mention that you also work on the podcast with Lane DeGregory. You have a separate podcast called Right Lane, and it covers true crime stories, probably a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah. But I want to know a little bit about how, I know there's so much to say about your experiences, but how did you meet Lane DeGregory? And was it, working at the Tampa Bay Times? There's probably so much to it.
She and I actually worked. The Tampa Bay Times was the second newsroom that we worked together at. The first newsroom was at the Virginian-Pilot in southeastern Virginia, back at the end of the last millennium, actually. So we met there and we worked together. She was a reporter on my narrative team, and then our paths diverged. She came down here to Florida. I ended up in Texas for a while. And then she called me when there was an opening here and said, come be my editor again. So I spent I spent 4 years with her at the Tampa Bay Times. So we just, we've worked so well together and had such a great relationships and became, great friends too. So, we followed our careers and raised our kids and stayed in very close touch. So obviously she's an amazing writer. I've been lucky to have, I've been in 7 newsrooms. I spent 36 years in daily journalism. So
so cool.
I still consider myself a journalist. Now I do more consulting and coaching, and still work with Lane on the podcast.
That's awesome. It's so cool. And we're going to come full circle because I'm going to bring this up at the end about the editor and writer relationship. But there's so much to talk about. And I just think it's so cool that you also served as a Pulitzer judge. Is that right?
Yeah, 6 times. Yeah. I was a Pulitzer juror 6 times. And
juror. Okay.
Yeah. Which is like, they go through a bunch of entries and try to get it down to the finalists. So
oh my God.
It's a great experience.
Yeah. Oh, I bet it is. And I wish I could just talk about just that alone is insane. I have so many questions about that. But anyway, okay, so let's go back to the book. So the book is, The Girl in the Window and Other True Tales. It's an anthology. Were you involved at all in the development of this book, creating this book? Did you help Lane put together these stories?
So when I came to work here in Tampa and, we were reunited, and she, of course, at this point has had a tremendous career with all these accolades. And I said, what else do you want to do in your career? And she said, boy, I'd really love to publish a book. So I was like, let's do that, So she connected with someone at the University of Chicago Press. And then it was a process of like kind of figuring out which stories were going to make it into the book. And then she and I worked on kind of her pieces of advice, So if you pick up the book, it's organized by different kinds of advice, and she has like footnotes and tags and things to sort of explain to you, how she got the story, what happened here, what kind of hurdles did she overcome, and talks about the reporting and gathering ideas and the writing and the editing and all of that. So I helped her sort of organize all of that and just kept pushing her forward. And so I'm really excited that it's finally published, because I don't think there's anything quite like it really out there in terms of not only an anthology, but all the advice that she offers.
That I can't wait to get my hands on a copy. I haven't gotten a copy of it yet because I feel like I just discovered this book like a few weeks ago. Yeah. So this is like a gem of a book. So that's very, very cool. And I knew that you probably did get involved in the developmental process of this book. So but let's really start at the beginning. And I want to go through this journey of your career too. So what led you at the very beginning into true crime, editing specifically true crime? Well,
as a journalist, and especially as a journalist in America, you can't really avoid crime. It's things are playing out all the time. Now, I will say that my interest wasn't so much about, the grisly nature of things and just like watching this horrible stuff unfold, but trying to answer the how and why. How did things happen and why did they happen? And get to hopefully make some sense out of things. So it's not just, we're not just jumping in and writing things gratuitously about awful things that happen to people, because that can be fascinating in and of itself. But then I know you were going to ask, we're going to talk a little bit about what goes into that. But to me, it's always about what's the takeaway beyond the obvious. Yes, these can be really compelling stories. But to me, there's also how do people survive this kind of thing? And how do, yes, a man's capacity to do things to each other is insane. But how do you come back from some of that? And how do people forgive some of what happens to them? That part of it is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is. And of course, like you said, there's the sensationalized, there's the drama, there's the shock factor. And that's what like turns heads. Like, what? Yeah. What happened? Oh my gosh, somebody murdered somebody, or a family member murdered another family member. It gets really, really deep, dark. It takes a special type of editor, doesn't it? So how do you walk away from hearing about certain things that are really intense? For me, I can just say personally, anything that involves a child, anything that involves, whether it's a murder, abuse, it stays with me and it bothers me. And it's really hard to shake it out of my head and move on to other things in my daily routine or daily life. Right. What is that like for you? Are you you had to have been good at separating it, right? But you probably didn't get to that.
No, not right away.
But it took you a while, right?
Yeah, but I, like you, especially when I became a parent, especially stories about children, I guess, but it becomes so much more personal and it feels so much harder to deal with. But it was always bothersome. I think journalists, like probably like police officers and firefighters, you end up compartmentalizing your life, and you try to keep separate to some degree, what happens at work. I know for me, I mean, it's just a personality thing, but I would not come home and just pour it all out because I wanted to leave it at the office if I could. And, but as an editor too, you've got to take care of your writers, and they are often even more, they're closer to it. They're on the front lines sometimes. As an editor, if we were working on something longer term, I might meet the subjects of the stories. I might go out there too to kind of make a connection so that I could better work the story and be a better editor. But for a lot of times too, it's just trying to understand what your writers are going through and how they process. Some of this stuff can be triggering to people. They're covering something that reminds them of their own lives. And you just, how can you not be crushed when you're dealing with some people who are going through the worst moments of their lives? So yeah, very difficult. But like I said, for me, compartmentalizing and trying to go home, sort of shut it down. The world is full of awful things that happen. It's also full of good things. So you do have to sort of try to find that,
Yeah. And over the years, because this isn't new for you. You've been doing this for years. You have so much experience. You know the difference between good storytelling and bad storytelling and the right way to get that story out there. So as you've been looking at things, have you identified patterns? Have you identified any type of themes? If I want, that's probably the wrong word to use, a theme, but I guess patterns is all I can think of right now to describe what maybe you've put together or pieced together in similar types of stories. So maybe it isn't a murder story, maybe a story that involves rape or abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. What are the themes or patterns that you've seen in the things that you've had to edit?
Yeah. Well, so even, certainly with true crime, but with all kinds of, when I'm coaching a writer through nonfiction, I'm always asking that question of what is the story really about? On the face of it, it might be an obvious situation, but what are we trying to get at? And I'll give you an example. So one of the stories that I'm really proud of that we did at the Tampa Bay Times was about a woman named Evelyn who unfortunately had been gang raped as a 17-year-old. And she'd gone her whole life without therapy because she didn't have insurance. She didn't have a way to pay for it. So she finally gets to Medicare at 65, and now she can go to therapy, right? So at 65, she's dealing with this rape from when she was 17 years old. Now, that on its face seems like a really powerful story. But one of the things that the writer and I are also looking for is, what is this story ultimately really going to be about? Not just on the face of it, finally getting help, but is there a theme? Is there something we can draw away from it? And at the end of the day, what the theme was on that story was forgiveness. And not forgiveness, not her forgiving them, her forgiving herself. She had kind of spent her whole life putting it on herself that she had made this mistake by trusting some individuals, and that, sort of everything in her life spiraled from there. And so therapy really got her to a place where she could forgive herself. And when I think of that, then that becomes a really powerful story to tell for anybody, regardless of whether you experience something similar or not, because we can all relate to forgiveness, and we can all relate to beating up on ourselves about one thing or another, right? So for me, when I'm coaching a writer, that's what I'm trying to get them to. Tell me, why are we telling this story? Not just on the face of it, it's a compelling story, but what is the reader going to take away from it? Not just the gratuitous nature of things. Right. There's something deeper there. And that's what you have to look for in every story. Right. And so there, you sent me some really great articles. And the one that, let's start with the one called 55 Minutes. Yeah. So this one is about an active shooter. This was a 3-part series, and it was published in 2016. Was this a Tampa Bay? This was actually at the Houston Chronicle. This was Houston Chronicle. And so, there's the first active shooter in the city of Houston. It happens on a Memorial Day weekend. Obviously, the attention is on what happens that weekend. But as we move past that, again, going back to the how and why, right? I'm fascinated by that. So I actually had an intern. Her name was Lauren Caruba. And she's now an investigative reporter with the Dallas Morning News. So I'm name dropping, but
cool.
she came to me and she's like, I'm really fascinated by the people who survived the shooting. Cause there were, this guy's out at a gas station and he's just shooting at people. Police have cordoned things off, but people are still driving into trouble. And we really hadn't caught up with who these people were and what actually happened to them during it and what happened to them after. So she did that. We identified 5 or 6 people who were involved. And it turned out to be this amazing story about people who sprung into action, a Boy Scout who used his training to help somebody who was shot, and, all of this drama that was going on. And then it becomes this like, what do you do in that moment, right? Because we're all waiting for that. Everybody now is so attuned to that in the United States. Are you going to get caught in an active shooting? And how will you respond when you do? And who will run towards it to help you? And who will run away? Right. All these kind of questions, right? So we ended up turning it into a 3-part series that was serialized. So it was like, stay with us. We're going to tell you we're going to play it out.
I saw that.
And it was, And so to me, again, it's not about being gratuitous about, oh my God, look at how awful this is. Look at all these people getting shot. But it's like, wow, look at the human story of overcoming in this moment, this thing that catches you totally off guard. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So how deeply were you involved in this editorial process? So let's walk it through for a typical editor who never gets to see this stuff. I mean, this is so fascinating to me. So is it you're part of that conversation as the writer develops it, or is it, hey, Maria, here's not manuscript, but here's my first draft.
Yeah, all the way through the process. All the way through the process.
Awesome.
So, I mean, I a lot of editors work differently. I love being there from the get-go and sort of talking through the idea and help, somebody is giving me their thoughts and thinking this is how we should do this. And I'm that first reader, right? I'm that first reaction and saying to them, no, I don't know about that. Or, we can't have 12 characters. That's way too many. Let's figure out the best ones to follow. Who's going to give you access? How are we going to do this? What's the structure going to be like? Where are we going to start? Where are we going to finish? Coaching them through that whole process. And then even coaching them through the outline of the story. How's this going to work? How are we going to break it off? Where are we going to end? I'm very big on endings. I think you got to know where you're going, right? Yeah. And so that's just the way I work, and I think awesome. It's a partnership. It's a partnership with and you're the person who's kind of giving some feedback and trying to explain, how it's striking you. Yeah.
This is like elite level book coaching. It's not even because you're really, you also have that reporter background too. So know the journalistic side of you that's going to the writer. So have there been instances where the writer is presenting quotes from the subjects, or you call them characters or people? They're people. It's not like characters in fiction, but their sources. Have you gone back to the writer and said, hey, can you go back and ask them this question? Almost like you're thinking like a journalist. Have you had to do that? Oh, yeah. Yeah. But again, that's the great give and take, right? They're telling you a story. Right. They're not writing it down yet. They're just, this is what I got, here's my idea. Here's some of the reporting I have. And then obviously you as the editor, you're thinking, oh, wait, what happened then? Or what did they say to that other person that they were with? Do they remember what the dialogue was? Do they remember what they were thinking in that moment? Which is a great question for an editor to ask. What were they thinking in that moment? So much internal dialogue is what goes on in people's minds when crazy things are happening. So drawing that out. And you had one of the questions I know we were thinking about talking about was just like, how much do you get out of them? I want as complete a reporting job as possible, right? So everything they can get their hands on to document what went on. And in this day and age, that involves, videos that people take on their phone. It's like tweets. When there was the Parkland shooting, some of the most amazing stuff was the tweets, the texts that people were sending back and forth to their spouses and their parents.
and that, that we got access to all that stuff. So you want as much of it as possible so that you can really tell the story with as much authority as possible. And you're not going to use all of that by any means. You've got to break down and really pick out what's most important.
And isn't that a struggle? That's always the never-ending struggle of an editor. Like, I want to put this in so bad, but we got to be selective. So, as an editor, you're looking at these articles with the lens of an editor. You're not, you have to go back and forth. There's a push and pull, and I know what that's like too. Reading as a reader, reading as an editor, cleaning things up, organization, structure. But narrative nonfiction is different. There's really a true balance. There's flow and rhythm. I noticed that it's cut and it's journalistic, obviously. This is true crime. This isn't fiction. And so these dialogue, that you have to insert dialogue throughout the story. How do you know when and when not to? And the dialogue is it's just cut and dry. And then there's a next line and then you cut. You have to find that balance. You're the editor. You're the ones getting the information.
Sure.
How do you know when to do it? How do you know when to pace it? What's good pacing?
Well, to me, and I love dialogue. I think dialogue can really bring a story to life. And, obviously there are moments that just crazy that, you captured in what somebody says. But now I've been lucky to be working with really gifted writers. So a lot of the times my coaching is, I don't need them to say it unless they're going to say it better than you can write it.
Okay.
So if you're telling me a story and you're setting the stage, as I hope you will, and you're creating all the kind of mood and scenes and putting me in a certain place, then, you're dropping in the dialogue when it's really helping to express emotion or give me a sense of place or a sense of the moment or something that's really telling about what's happening, right? So there will be times where somebody's dropping in some dialogue and I'll think that's not adding enough to me, or it's not giving me something. I think a lot of writers equate dialogue with voice. Mm-hmm. And to me, it's not quite the same thing. A writer's voice is everything, is the way that they put the story together, is the way they pace the story. Where do they add short paragraphs? Where do they add longer paragraphs? What are they trying to get you to feel through what they incorporate? Right. And dialogue's really important to that. You need those moments. We talked earlier about the rape story, the woman who went back to counseling, who finally went to counseling. And that was written, by the way, by Leonora, LaPeter, Anton, who's another Pulitzer winner from the Tampa Bay Times. But, her dialogue when she was recounting the rape itself, she remembered what one of her rapists had said to her as he drops her underwear back in her hands. That's a moment that Leonora's not going to be able to, that's something you got to use that moment because she's remembering it, 50 years later. Right. It's still stuck in her head, right? So that has this power to it. And so that's what I would look like. I'd look for, I think, with dialogue is always, where's the power in those words? What are the way that people are saying things and how they're saying it, right?
And I think we're really speaking to the heart of what separates a regular story from a Pulitzer Prize winning level story. I mean, it's these nuances that people don't realize when it's getting, you're truly just like going straight to the heart of these stories when you're putting in the dialogue. So I don't think a typical reader would realize how important dialogue is. And I thought it was worth talking about that,
for sure. And a dialogue to me is and also details, what details are you using and what details are you not using? Right. You can overdo it with a detail and you can kind of lose a reader in a bunch of minutia that maybe isn't as important. Right. Like, do you really need to know exactly everything about the murder scene in a particular case, say, or are there particular things that you need to point out because they're going to come back again later, or they're going to be important to the evidence, or they're important to someone's claim of innocence? What is it? You got to be very particular with how much you include, because like we had talked about earlier, you want to get everything you can. Right. I'm a great believer when you're doing nonfiction that you try to get as much information as you can, but then you're probably only going to use 5 or 10% of it if you're doing it right, right? Because you're really making choices about what the reader needs to know to really make that story powerful.
Yeah. And that's where your expertise comes in. So only Maria would know, you know, you're looking at an article, you're just like this. I mean, you've been doing this for so long, you know, okay, that goes in, that does not go in. We can do without this information, but this is the nugget of information the readers need. And so that's what makes the compelling story. And so you spoke a little bit about like, this is speaking to the ethical standards and practices behind this. You may be looking at gruesome photos, very disturbing. They could be images or details that you're reading. How do you know where that line should be drawn? You know, I'm sure there's courses about this, you know.
Well, you know, it's funny. I had an editor, a boss years and years ago who said to me, put your mother in the place of that subject, you know? Or it could be your sister or your brother or whatever, right? Okay. Make it personal for you. So how would you treat that situation and that person if it were somebody close to you? So in other words, when you look at it that way, then you're doing it a little bit with kid gloves. Now, you can't write about crime without, I mean, it's awful. There's just nothing to be said about that, right? But can you write about it in a way that still affords people some dignity and some respect? And how many, again, it goes back to those details, right? If I'm editing a story that involves a rape or a gruesome murder, you know, I'm always thinking, how much do you really need to know? And does your mind going to fill it in anyway? Right. Like if I stop here, the rapist is going to take her into this abandoned building. You know what's about to happen. How much do I need to tell you? Or is it even worse in your head anyway? Like, do you really need the play-by-play, right? If you're talking about a child's murder, how much do I really need to tell you for you to take it away? So again, to me, it's always like, am I treating this situation and this person with a certain level of respect, right? I mean, journalists get a bad rap, like we're just, you know, awful people who are preying on people's worst situations.
Sensationalizing
I want them to feel like it's, you know, we're being honest, but we're not being gratuitous.
And that's what these in-depth articles are all about. I mean, that's what the in-depth meaning, not the grotesque or the gruesome details. It's in depth into the psychological aspect of what these people are going through, the victims, what they're going through. And so there's so much to be said for covering true crime because yes, it can be sensationalized and yes, it is shocking. There's the shock factor. Oh my God. But there is so much more where it can have a major social impact. And this is talking about the nature of criminals who are, you know, set free with who shouldn't be. So a failing criminal system or justice system, I should say. And who can bring that to light other than maybe a journalist to say, here's the story. Here's how this person got let off. And how did this happen? Or, you know, the impact that a journalist can have in maintaining these standards, I think is huge. And I think that I'd like to hear your thoughts about the social impact that these types of stories can have.
Well, and that for sure that you're talking about, you know, there's obviously people who are wrongly imprisoned and there's cases where, you know, everything goes wrong. But I think where people also find this nugget in true crime stories is this idea of like people who overcome this tremendous amount of trauma that they go through. I mean, particularly, you know, victim stories where someone survives something that you can't even begin to imagine, and they find the fortitude to move forward and remake their lives and maybe forgive the people who did things to them. I mean, that's incredible. Those kind of stories are just amazing. So I don't know, for me, that kind of the triumph of the human spirit, and like, of course, that also happens in like really like hurricane stories and people overcoming things. But that with true crime stories, you know, people who manage to survive all of this and somehow rise to the occasion, you know, the Boy Scout who actually goes and starts using his Boy Scout training in the middle of a mass shooting. You know, it's like,
amazing.
You know, would you be that person? I don't know if I'd be that person.
I would be probably the person peeing in my pants and running and hiding.
Right. I was like, I'm driving the other way.
I can't, I shouldn't be laughing, but it's so true. And I think that's, again, speaking to the differences between, you know, an article that's just out there sensationalizing versus an article that's award winning. And I think that's really the difference here that we're talking about.
For sure. And then just like we're talking about, I think a lot about the Parkland shooting, and we did a story on a teacher who was in her closet with a bunch of her students as the shooting's going on. And then a week later, she's trying to go back to school and prove to herself that she can go back to being a teacher. She can overcome her fear, you know? And it just made me think about, oh my God, what teachers have to go through nowadays. It's not just like teaching knuckleheads. It's like, you possibly, your life is in danger, and you have to protect these kids and it really is a life or death situation now. So how inspiring is that, and how compelling is that you have people who do that and are putting themselves in? I mean, she went back to teaching, which I'm not sure everybody would have done. So all of those, to me, those crime stories are really about our nature and how do we overcome these horrible things that happen.
Yeah. So, and that's why they're so compelling, I think. You know, that's why people get sucked in and want to know, well, what happened next? Oh my gosh. So why did this happen? You want to know why, how, you know, and then obviously how people overcome, like you just said. And it is the fascinating part of the story for sure. Yeah. So, there's so much to ask you.
I know. We could talk for days.
I know. There's so much.
Part 3 and part 4.
You know, I think we're probably going to have to do part 3, but we'll see. We'll talk offline about that. But I think, you know, let's end on a note for editors who are just interested in this. Maybe they're not journalists. Maybe they are book coaches. Maybe they're, you know, looking at a manuscript that is, you know, they have no connection to the writer, but that they are just copy editing and, you know, sending notes back to the writer. There's different scenarios, and it could be a memoir. Right. It doesn't have to necessarily be an investigative article. So for those editors who are not journalists, but are touching into that world of true crime, what advice would you share with those types of editors? You know, we talked about the internal struggle, you know, separating the work from your personal life. We could, you know, you could go there, but the actual craft of editing. What advice would you share with an editor who is interested or is actually doing this stuff right now, doing exactly what you're describing? What can you say to the editor?
Well, I mean, like you've pointed out, there's so much out there now too. That's really interesting. There's a lot of true crime podcasts. There's a lot of true crime documentaries. I would say, you know, try to be a student before you become a teacher. Like break down what some of these stories work and why they work or why they don't work. Like, what was it that kept you riveted all the way through? Or if you lost interest, why did you lose interest? You know, what was the thread that you think maybe they didn't pick out right? Because I think there's so many good ones out there, and there's some they're not as good, but there really are some amazing stories out there. But again, I'm drawn by the emotional punch, the stories that really, it wasn't just about something awful happening, but about human nature and how we recovered from it and how we moved past it, or, you know, reconciled ourselves to it. How did you become stronger in the aftermath? So if you want to do that kind of work, I think analyzing it and studying it and really understanding, like we've been talking about, why did they include this detail? Why did they include this bit of dialogue? Well, how did they pace it a certain way? Who are the characters that they focused on and why? Right. For nonfiction, it's always about accessibility. Do you have a character who's going to allow you in, right? Would they give you that? And sometimes you can tell that the character hasn't allowed the writer in. But like I said, becoming a student of it is the way, I think, to become a better teacher, honestly.
So what books should we read? And it's funny because there are parallels with, and it's adjacent to fiction. You know, you're telling a story. Right. It's, you know, fiction is a little bit more, I mean, obviously it's not the same as nonfiction, but there are similarities in the editorial process. There's that storytelling.
Oh, for sure. There's characters, there's plot, there's all of it. There's a lot of similarities. Well, you know, everybody's you should go back to In Cold Blood.
Okay.
I mean, because it's where it all started, really. And I remember reading, as grisly as this sounds, The Executioner Song when I was in high school from Norman Mailer. But Truman Capote got it all started with just taking a situation of a murder and turning it into real people and real characters and kind of, putting you in that moment. And you can still read it and it holds up pretty darn well. Yeah. So, I mean, again, if you want to be a student of it, there's a lot of accessible stuff out there. And some of the stories that we've talked to about, Lane's book has probably 3 or 4 crime stories in it that are really fascinating. And again, great to study and to become a student of them.
I can't thank you enough for this interview, Maria. This has been so great. And what you made it feel like is that it isn't so far out of reach for editors. I think that's the cool thing about this conversation is that it is within reach for a typical editor and how important the editor is in this writing process. I want to go deeper and talk about the editor-writer relationship. I have questions about how you're a juror for the award-winning, prize-winning articles. I mean, there's so much to talk about. But again, what the goal and essence of this conversation was really about the accessibility for editors, what editors go through, making these big decision-making power behind the editorial process. And there's something to be said for that. So again, thank you so much. I hope we stay in touch.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.
So great. I can't wait to read more about this stuff. This is so outside of my world of editing, but you make it seem really cool. So I'm interested.
Well, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Editor's Half Hour. This podcast is your go-to resource for editorial trends, opening the discussion for new ideas through the real-life stories of editors. For more information about Nadia Jaja Pupa and her business, visit peakpublishing.com. That's PIQUE publishing.com. Be sure to follow Peak Publishing on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And remember to subscribe and follow the Editor's Half Hour wherever you get your podcasts.